She arrived at his mansion with a single suitcase and a heartbreaking plea, and the billionaire never imagined the next words out of her mouth would call him Dad. Andrew Riddle had ended countless evenings in quiet solitude, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight waiting at the gates of his mansion that night. The estate shimmered in soft golden lighting, the air still and crisp, and yet the world felt suddenly tilted when he noticed a small figure standing just beyond the security line. She was tiny, no more than 6 years old, dressed in a pink t-shirt and a red skirt, her blonde hair tangled from the wind, her shoes worn down to thin soles. Her blue eyes, impossibly large for her face, fixed on him with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something deeper, something that made Andrew's chest tighten before she even spoke. She clutched a faded photograph against her chest as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. When the guards hesitated to approach her, Andrew stepped forward himself. There was something in the way the girl looked at him that rooted him to the ground, something hauntingly familiar. She took a shaky breath and her voice came out barely louder than a whisper, trembling as though every word cost her effort. "Dad. I'm not asking for much, just to bury my mom." The simplicity of the plea struck him harder than a blow. For a moment he could only stare, unable to reconcile her words with the reality he thought he knew. The title she used hit him with icy precision. "What? Dad?" he repeated, unable to mask his confusion or the strange shock blooming inside him. The girl extended the photograph with both hands, her fingers shaking. On the worn picture was a woman he had spent years trying not to think about, Alyssa Morton. Her smile, once the brightest part of his youth, stared back at him like a ghost. She had vanished from his life 6 years ago without a word, leaving him with unanswered questions and a hollow ache he pretended had healed. Seeing her face again reopened every wound he had buried under layers of success and work. "That's my mom," the little girl said, her voice breaking. "She died yesterday. And they told me I have to do everything alone." The last word cracked, as though she had reached the edge of her strength. Andrew felt the world shift beneath him. He recognized the woman, recognized the timeline, recognized the impossible resemblance in the girl's eyes. His throat tightened as he looked down at her. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, afraid of the answer and yet needing it. "Lily," she whispered. "Mom said, if something happened to her, I should find you." The air around them thickened. Lily. 6 years old. The same blue eyes. The same shape of jaw. The same way she pressed her lips together when scared, just like Alyssa. It was as though the universe had delivered him a truth he never suspected existed. A truth wrapped in grief and desperation. Before he could speak again, Lily swayed slightly on her feet, as though her small body was finally giving up. Andrew instinctively reached out and caught her, feeling how cold she was, how light, how fragile. He didn't hesitate after that. He ordered security to escort them inside, called the household doctor, told his staff to bring blankets and food. His home, built for extravagance and power, suddenly felt too large and too empty as the tiny girl was carried through the halls. Yet even as she was warmed and fed and settled in a guest room, the question that shook his entire identity pressed against him with relentless force. Was she truly his daughter? There was only one way to find out, and he already knew what he would do. The photograph trembled in his hand as he made the call for an emergency DNA test. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to see what awaited below but knowing the fall had already begun. Tonight, something irreversible had entered his life. And nothing, not his wealth, not his control, not the careful walls he built around his heart, could stop what was coming. Andrew barely slept that night, drifting through the hours like a man trapped between two realities. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the little girl's face, the trembling way she said, "Dad," the heartbreaking steadiness with which she asked only for her mother's burial. He kept the photograph of Alyssa on his desk as if afraid it would disappear if he looked away too long, tracing the torn edges with a thumb that felt heavier than it should. The more he stared at her smile, the more the unease in him grew, because deep inside, beneath layers of denial, something already knew the truth. It was in Lily's eyes, in her voice, in the shape of her cheeks, tiny echoes of a love he had never fully let go. When the sun finally rose, soft and pale over the estate, he asked the maid to be careful not to wake the child. Lily had fallen asleep clutching the blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. Her small suitcase lay beside the couch, a few shirts, a pair of cheap shoes, a crumpled notebook with childish drawings, and a single hair tie that looked like it had been stretched far beyond its life. Everything about her presence screamed survival, not childhood. A knock on the office door pulled Andrew from his thoughts. His private physician entered quietly, informing him that Lily was physically exhausted but unharmed, severely stressed, dehydrated, and clearly undernourished. The words hit him harder than he expected. A child who should have been laughing and playing had been wandering alone, begging strangers for help, carrying a grief too heavy for her small shoulders. When Lily finally woke, she stepped into his office hesitantly, clutching the oversized sweater the maid had given her. Her hair was still messy from sleep, and her eyes, though rested, carried the weight of someone who had seen far too much. She looked around the room as if afraid something might jump out at her. Andrew motioned gently for her to sit, and she obeyed without a word, perching on the edge of the chair like she might need to run at any moment. "Lily," he began carefully, forcing his voice to stay steady, "I need to understand what happened. Can you tell me about your mother's last days?" She pulled her knees up slightly and hugged them, staring at the floor. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Andrew was about to reassure her she didn't need to, when her voice suddenly emerged, quiet but firm, shaped by a fear she had carried alone. "Mommy got sick," she said slowly. "She didn't have money for doctors. She worked and worked, but people were mean. They said she owed them things. They yelled. Mommy cried sometimes at night. I pretended not to hear." Her breath caught, but she continued. "When she got worse, she told me, if she couldn't wake up one day, I had to find you. She said you were the only person who would help me." Andrew felt something twist painfully inside him. Alyssa had run from him years ago, but she hadn't run because she didn't care. She had run because she was scared, scared of something he didn't yet understand. He wanted to ask more, but his phone vibrated with the alert he had been waiting for all night: DNA results available. The words burned on the screen. His pulse hammered as he opened the file. The world around him seemed to blur, the walls fading, the air thinning, until all that existed was the bold line confirming what he had tried so desperately not to hope for and not to fear. Lily Riddle, biological daughter. He didn't realize he had stopped breathing until a small hand touched his sleeve. Lily's voice was fragile as porcelain. "Did I do something wrong?" The question shattered him. "No," he said, kneeling so he could meet her eyes directly. "You did nothing wrong. Everything you've said, everything you've been through, none of it is your fault." She blinked, confused and frightened, still waiting for something terrible to happen. He exhaled and forced his voice not to tremble. "Lily. I know the truth now. And you are not alone. You're my daughter. I'm your father." For a long second she didn't react at all, as if unsure whether she was allowed to believe it. Then her breath hitched and tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she whispered, "Then, can you really bury Mommy? Can you help her?" Andrew gathered her gently into his arms, feeling her small frame shake against him. She didn't sob loudly like children usually do, she shook silently, as though she had learned long ago not to make noise when hurting. "I'll take care of everything," he murmured. "I promise you, Lily. I won't fail you again." And in that moment, he knew his life, everything he had built, every wall he had constructed, had already changed forever. The funeral preparations moved quickly, but nothing about the process felt real to Andrew. He arranged the finest service the city could offer, hired specialists, ordered flowers Alyssa once loved, and secured a peaceful burial site, yet every decision cut deeper than the last. He kept imagining what her life must have been like during the years she was gone, wondering how much suffering she hid, how much fear she carried, and how many times she wanted to reach out but didn't. Lily stayed close to him while everything was organized, like a small shadow trailing behind his steps. She rarely spoke, but she watched everything carefully, as though afraid something might be taken from her again. Several times she tugged at his sleeve to ask if she could help, and even though there was little a 6-year-old could do, Andrew let her hand him flowers, pick a ribbon, or choose the dress her mother would be buried in. He noticed the way her hands trembled each time. She was trying to be strong in a world that had given her too much grief far too early. When the day arrived, the funeral home was quiet, filled with soft music and warm lighting. Lily stood at the casket with her chin lifted, whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Andrew gave her privacy, standing a few feet away, wrestling with the storm inside him. He had imagined many futures in his life, some full of success, others of solitude, but never this, standing beside the daughter he had never known, mourning the woman he once thought he had a lifetime to understand. As guests filtered in, staff from the mansion, a few distant acquaintances, medical personnel who had tended to Alyssa in her final days, Andrew felt guilt wrap around his throat like a tightening collar. He should have been there. He should have known. He should have protected them both. When the ceremony ended, Lily slipped her hand into his without a word, and together they watched the casket lower. Her small fingers tightened as though the ground was stealing the last piece of her world. Andrew knelt beside her, telling her she could cry if she needed to, but Lily only shook her head and pressed her lips together. "Mommy said I have to be brave," she whispered. He realized then that bravery was not something she chose, it was something she had been forced into. In the following days, Andrew began digging into Alyssa's past, determined to piece together what had really happened. The more he learned, the less he understood how she had survived as long as she had. The landlord of their old apartment mentioned late-night arguments, a man coming by demanding money, and Alyssa's insistence that no one contact authorities. A neighbor recalled seeing her crying on the stairs. A pharmacist admitted she often came for medication but couldn't afford it. Every story carved another sharp edge into Andrew's conscience. Late one evening, while sorting through Alyssa's personal belongings retrieved from the apartment, he found documents that made his blood run cold, forged signatures, stolen account numbers, and evidence pointing to fraudulent business transactions done in her name. Shock rippled through him. Someone had used her identity. Someone had trapped her financially, threatening her stability and safety. And whoever that person was, they had been close enough to him to know how to exploit her. When he examined the handwriting on one of the forms more closely, recognition struck him with brutal clarity. He had seen that handwriting hundreds of times, on memos, contracts, and emails. It belonged to his former partner, Thomas Baylor. Andrew sat motionless, gripping the papers until they crumpled in his hands. The betrayal was staggering. Thomas had been one of the people he trusted most, someone he had mentored and defended. Now it seemed that while Andrew built an empire, Thomas had been building a trap around the woman Andrew once loved. Alyssa must have tried to fight it, must have threatened to expose him, and Thomas had silenced her with fear instead of violence, but the outcome was the same. She had died alone, isolated, and terrified. Lily had been left to suffer the consequences. Andrew closed his eyes, struggling to keep his rage from breaking loose. For the first time since Lily appeared at his gate, fear surged through him, not for himself, but for her. If Thomas had threatened Alyssa, what stopped him from threatening the child who might expose him? He rose abruptly and went to find Lily. She was in the guest room, sitting on the floor drawing circles with crayons. When she heard him enter, she looked up with the same guarded expression she wore the first night. He sat beside her, unable to hide the urgency in his voice. "Lily, when you lived with your mom, did a man named Thomas ever visit you?" She froze, then slowly nodded. He yelled, she whispered. Mommy always told me to hide when he came. She said he was dangerous. Andrew swallowed hard. He wanted to pick her up and never let go. The evidence was no longer just paperwork. It was in her memories. He made a silent vow then, one that burned hotter than any rage. Thomas Baylor had stolen years from Alyssa, stolen safety from Lily, and stolen the truth from Andrew. Now Andrew would take back everything: justice, protection, and the future that Lily deserved. Nothing would stop him. In the days that followed his discovery, Andrew moved with a calmness so controlled it bordered on frightening. Beneath that controlled surface, however, pulsed a fury he had never known, a calculated, icy determination to expose the truth and to protect Lily at any cost. He summoned private investigators, forensic accountants, digital analysts, and attorneys he trusted with his life. What emerged from their combined work painted a picture far darker than he expected. Thomas hadn't just used Alyssa's identity for a few fraudulent transactions. He had orchestrated an elaborate scheme spanning years, siphoning funds, rerouting assets, and using Alyssa as the perfect scapegoat. Every time she tried to resist or cut ties, he tightened his hold with new threats. She had been cornered, powerless, and alone. And Andrew hadn't even realized she was out there fighting a silent battle that should never have been hers to fight. One evening, while the legal team sorted documents in the conference room, Andrew walked to the guest wing where Lily was staying. She had begun to speak a little more, to draw pictures, to ask tentative questions about the house and the people in it, though she still moved with the caution of someone expecting the ground to collapse at any moment. When he knocked and entered, she was sitting on the carpet surrounded by crayons, drawing a picture of a woman with long hair. He recognized Alyssa immediately, even though the lines were childlike and the proportions uneven. The moment Lily saw him, she tried to hide the drawing behind her back, but he gently took her small hand and asked to see it. She hesitated, then surrendered the paper. "That's Mommy," she said quietly. "I didn't want her to disappear." The words cut deep. Andrew sat beside her, feeling the weight of her grief, her fear, her smallness in a world that had been nothing but merciless. "She won't disappear," he told her, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. "Not while you're here. Not while I'm here." As the investigation intensified, Andrew found himself juggling two versions of reality, one filled with boardrooms, legal documents, and strategy meetings, and another filled with bedtime routines, spilled crayons, and the quiet presence of a child trying to learn trust. But the two worlds collided unexpectedly one afternoon. He had stepped into the hallway just in time to hear Lily gasp and stumble back as a tall figure turned the corner. It was Thomas. He had entered the estate under the pretense of a scheduled meeting, unaware of the storm gathering around him. The moment his eyes met Lily's, something like cold calculation flickered across his face. Lily froze, and Andrew, seeing the terror in her expression, felt something inside him snap. He moved between them instinctively, positioning himself like a shield. Thomas raised his hands as though feigning innocence, but his expression betrayed him: annoyance, anger, and something darker simmered beneath the surface. "I didn't know you had guests," Thomas said casually, though his voice lacked its usual smoothness. "Seems we should talk in private." Andrew's reply was steady, controlled, almost too calm. "We will. But not the way you expect." His tone carried a warning Thomas didn't yet understand. He escorted Lily back to her room, kneeling beside her before closing the door. "You're safe here," he told her. "I won't let anyone hurt you." When he returned to the office, his demeanor had transformed. Every trace of softness vanished, replaced by the steel of a man who could, and would, ruin anything or anyone necessary. He confronted Thomas with the evidence, laying the documents on the desk one by one. With each page turned, Thomas's arrogance faltered. First confusion, then irritation, then realization flickered across his face. He attempted to deny, deflect, laugh off the accusations. But Andrew had come prepared. There were bank transfers, IP logs, signed documents, audio recordings, witness testimonies, surveillance timestamps, pieces of a puzzle meticulously assembled into an undeniable truth. For the first time in the years they'd known each other, Thomas's voice cracked. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Andrew answered, leaning forward so the space between them felt suffocating. "You stole from me. You used Alyssa. You terrorized her. And you put my daughter in danger." The last word came out with a force that made Thomas flinch. Before Thomas could retreat or negotiate, Andrew delivered the final blow. He informed him that law enforcement had already been notified. The only reason Thomas was still standing here was because Andrew wanted to watch the guilt register in his eyes before the inevitable collapse. He pressed the intercom and instructed security to escort Thomas out and detain him until authorities arrived. Thomas attempted one last threat, muttering that Andrew didn't know the full story, that this would ruin him, that Lily would bring more trouble than he realized. But his words no longer mattered. He was exposed, cornered, stripped of every ounce of the control he once wielded. As Thomas was dragged out, Andrew remained still, hands braced on the desk, breathing slowly through the storm inside him. Only when the house finally fell silent again did he allow himself to acknowledge the truth. Lily had saved him from the lie he was living, from ignorance, from a betrayal so deep it would have destroyed him later. And now it was his turn to save her, from fear, from instability, from ever feeling alone again. Andrew expected the arrest to bring closure, but instead it opened a new chapter of chaos. The media caught wind almost instantly, painting headlines with his name, Alyssa's tragedy, and hints of a secret child. Cameras gathered at the gates, reporters tried bribing employees, and speculation spread like wildfire. Andrew's legal team advised silence, but silence felt cowardly when Lily walked through the halls clutching a stuffed bear someone from the staff had given her, flinching each time she heard raised voices or footsteps too loud. She didn't understand what exposure meant, but she understood noise, tension, danger, and she reacted to it like a child used to surviving storms rather than living in peace. To shield her, Andrew moved her into a private wing of the mansion, away from windows facing the street. He installed additional security, instructed staff to avoid unnecessary conversations near her, and rearranged his schedule so that he could spend mornings and evenings with her. Each small routine became a tether between them: breakfast where she tried new foods cautiously, quiet drawing sessions in his office, evenings where she would settle beside him with a blanket while he reviewed documents. She didn't speak much, but her presence had begun to soften the spaces around him, turning sterile rooms into something that felt almost lived in. Despite her progress, one night shattered the fragile calm. Andrew was working late when he heard a muffled cry echo down the hallway. He followed the sound to Lily's room and found her curled under the covers, trembling. When he approached cautiously, she grabbed the front of his shirt, burying her face in the fabric. Between sobs she whispered that she dreamed Thomas was standing in the room, taking her away, telling her no one could protect her. The fear in her voice pierced him more deeply than any courtroom confrontation could. He lifted her gently, carrying her to the armchair, rocking her the way he imagined a father should. Her small fingers twisted into the fabric of his sleeve, as if gripping the last safe thing she knew. He stayed until she fell asleep, her cheek pressed against his chest, and only then did he realize he wasn't simply comforting her, he needed her closeness as much as she needed his. Knowing she had suffered such terror for so long ignited something inside him that felt both protective and painfully tender. The vulnerability of loving her frightened him, yet he embraced it because anything else felt impossible. Over the next days, he hired child psychologists, trauma specialists, teachers willing to work privately. Each offered insights into Lily's emotional state, delayed trust, hypervigilance, suppressed grief, defensive maturity. She wasn't broken, she had simply never been given the chance to be a child. Andrew absorbed every recommendation, adjusting his behaviors, softening his tone, learning how to provide reassurance beyond words. He discovered that Lily responded best not to coaxing but to consistency. She needed proof, not promises. But as he devoted himself to Lily, the investigation into Alyssa's suffering deepened. Evidence revealed that Thomas had accomplices, two executives who had helped forge documents and transfer money overseas. Andrew realized that Alyssa's fear had been justified. She hadn't been hiding from him, she had been hiding from a network of people exploiting her vulnerability. One wrong step, one disclosure, would have endangered both her and Lily. That knowledge tormented him. If she had reached out years ago, he would have protected her. If he hadn't let pride or confusion keep him from searching for answers, perhaps she would still be alive. The guilt became unbearable one afternoon when he found Lily in the garden, kneeling in the grass, pressing flower petals into the soil. She looked up when she sensed him and said in a small voice, "Mommy liked flowers. I want her to have some in heaven." Andrew knelt beside her, unable to speak for a moment. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "If you knew about me before, would you come for us?" The question carved directly into the rawest parts of him. He cupped her face gently, feeling the coolness of her cheeks, the fragility of her trust. "Yes," he answered, his voice rough from emotion he could no longer hide. "I would have come. I would have never let anything happen to either of you." She studied his expression as if searching for cracks, as if weighing the truth in his eyes. Then she leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. "I'm glad you came now," she murmured, and the simple sincerity of her words washed over him like absolution he didn't deserve. From that day on, Lily began to change. She laughed more. She reached for his hand first. She asked questions about his childhood, his favorite foods, his work. She followed him around the house in quiet companionship, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and affection. Andrew felt something inside him expand unbearably each time she chose him, when she slipped her small hand into his without prompting, when she asked if he would be home for dinner, when she climbed onto the couch beside him with her blanket, trusting him enough to fall asleep against his arm. Yet even as their bond strengthened, Andrew sensed the shadow looming behind them. Thomas's arrest was only the beginning. The accomplices were still out there, the media frenzy was growing, and Lily's sense of safety was still fragile. He knew there would be more battles, more revelations, more threats. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the fight. He had someone worth protecting, someone who, without knowing it, had already given him more purpose than all the wealth he had ever accumulated. The deeper the investigators dug, the more Andrew realized he had underestimated both the scale of the conspiracy and the danger surrounding it. Thomas might have been the architect, but the network supporting him had roots that reached far into Andrew's company. Two senior executives, men Andrew had worked beside for years, were implicated in forging signatures, redirecting funds, and threatening Alyssa whenever she tried to expose them. The thought that she had faced all of this alone made Andrew burn with shame, but there was no time to sit with guilt. Every file retrieved, every witness testimony gathered, every bank record uncovered pointed to one reality: the people who had destroyed Alyssa's life might come after Lily next, especially now that Thomas had been arrested and the investigation had become public. Andrew doubled security at every entrance to the mansion, added surveillance to the grounds, and hired a specialized protection team whose presence was discreet but constant. He briefed them personally, emphasizing that nothing, absolutely nothing, was to jeopardize Lily's safety. Still, anxiety gnawed at him. He had experienced corporate wars, political sabotage, and financial crises, but none of those risks had ever felt as personal or as terrifying as the idea of losing the little girl who had only recently begun to trust him. One morning, he woke to a storm of missed calls. The press had published leaked documents from the investigation, including Lily's existence. Her name wasn't printed, but the description, an alleged child connected to the deceased victim, was enough to ignite a frenzy. Reporters clustered at the end of his driveway, helicopters hovered overhead, and the public speculated wildly. Andrew's legal team scrambled to contain the damage, but the situation spiraled faster than they could act. Inside the mansion, Lily sat on the floor hugging her stuffed bear tightly, startled each time a camera flash flickered through the windows. When one of the security guards raised his voice outside to push away an intruder, she flinched violently and hid behind the couch. Andrew rushed to her, kneeling and gently pulling her into his arms. She trembled like a leaf in harsh wind, and he whispered soothing words, telling her she was safe, telling her no one would take her away. She didn't speak, but she buried her face against his shoulder, clinging to him with a desperation that made him feel both fiercely protective and painfully helpless. After she calmed, he carried her to his office, where the noise was muted, and let her sit beside him while he strategized with attorneys and media consultants. Every so often she glanced at him as if checking to see whether he would disappear. He always met her gaze with a reassuring nod. By afternoon, the chaos outside escalated further. Someone had leaked the detail that Lily had approached Andrew on the day of Alyssa's death. Opportunistic journalists twisted the narrative, implying scandal, inheritance disputes, even fabricated accusations about Andrew's involvement. The cruelty of it was staggering, and when he read a headline questioning Lily's paternity, something in him hardened to steel. He would not let the world tear apart the child who had already lost everything. That night, after the staff retreated and the mansion quieted, Andrew found Lily in the guest room sitting on the edge of the bed with her small backpack open beside her. She had stuffed a few shirts inside and was clutching her worn teddy bear in her lap. When she heard him enter, she didn't look up but whispered, "I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." Andrew knelt in front of her, feeling his heart twist painfully. "Lily," he said gently, "look at me." She lifted her eyes slowly, and he saw the same fear that had lived in Alyssa's eyes years ago, the fear of being a burden, of being unwanted, of being the cause of someone else's suffering. "You are not trouble," he continued, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're my daughter. I'm supposed to protect you. That's my job, not yours." She studied him with uncertainty, as though waiting for the moment he would take it back. When he didn't, she whispered, "People outside are mad. They say you're bad now. They say I ruined your life." Her voice cracked on the last word. Andrew felt something inside him break. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she trembled. "No," he said, voice low but fierce. "You didn't ruin anything. You saved me. And I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you." Lily clung to him until her breathing steadied, and when she finally released him, he saw that her eyes were still wide with lingering fear but softened with trust. "What if they take me?" she whispered. "They won't," he promised. "I won't let anyone take you." To reinforce that promise, he contacted his attorney immediately and initiated emergency custody filings. The legal path would be complicated, but Andrew wasn't a man who let obstacles decide outcomes. He would fight for Lily with every resource he had. And as he watched her finally drift to sleep, curled against his arm, her small hand gripping the fabric of his sleeve, he realized he had never been more certain of anything in his life. Protecting Lily wasn't an obligation. It wasn't even redemption. It was purpose. And he would face every enemy, every headline, and every threat to keep her safe. The legal battle for custody unfolded with a level of intensity Andrew had never anticipated, though he approached it with the same relentless precision he brought to hostile takeovers and corporate warfare. But this was not business. This was Lily, fragile, brave, wounded Lily, and every decision carried the weight of her future. His attorneys assembled a case demonstrating his paternity, his capability to provide care, and the danger posed by the criminal network that had exploited Alyssa. Yet the court required thorough evaluations, psychological assessments, home inspections, background checks, interviews with staff, and a child welfare specialist assigned to observe Lily's adjustment. Andrew submitted to every requirement without hesitation, but he couldn't help noticing how each appointment exhausted Lily, reopening fears she had barely begun to heal from. The specialist, a gentle woman named Dr. Rowan, visited several times and watched their interactions carefully. Lily was cautious at first, responding to questions with short nods or whispered phrases, but she gradually began to open up. She described making breakfast with Andrew, picking flowers in the garden, sitting beside him during work hours, and how he read to her before bed. What caught Dr. Rowan's attention most, however, was the way Lily reached for Andrew without thinking, climbing into his lap when she grew tired, resting her head against his shoulder, gripping his sleeve when someone unfamiliar entered the room. The attachment was unmistakable, and its depth spoke volumes about the safety she felt in his presence. Yet despite the progress, not everything was peaceful. One afternoon, while Andrew was in a meeting with his attorneys, a social worker asked to speak with Lily privately. Lily panicked, believing she was being taken away. She clung to Andrew with such force that he had to gently pry her fingers from his shirt, reassuring her again and again that she wasn't going anywhere. Even after the social worker left, Lily remained shaken, refusing to leave his side for the rest of the day. Andrew realized then that trauma was not something solved by rescue, it lingered, resurfacing in sudden waves. He found himself adjusting his world to accommodate her needs without a second thought. The investigation into Thomas's accomplices reached a turning point around the same time. Evidence surfaced that the two executives had not only threatened Alyssa but attempted to manipulate corporate systems to cover their tracks now that the investigation was public. They were arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and obstruction. Andrew attended every hearing, partly for justice and partly to ensure they saw him, the man whose family they had destroyed, standing stronger than ever. When the verdict came back pending trial, he felt a measure of peace, though not enough to erase the pain. What he hadn't expected was the letter delivered to his home days later. It came from Alyssa's estranged relatives, people he had never met, demanding custody of Lily on the grounds that family should raise family. The moment he read the letter, a cold dread gripped him. They cited heritage, bloodlines, and moral duty, ignoring the fact that they had never once tried to help Alyssa or her daughter while they were alive together. His attorneys assured him that the claims were weak compared to his own, especially given Lily's emotional bond with him, but Andrew wasn't reassured. He pictured Lily being taken from him, fearful, confused, pulled away from the first stable home she had ever known, and the thought alone made his stomach twist. That evening, while he sat at his desk drowning in legal documents, Lily wandered in silently holding a drawing. She placed it on the table without speaking. The picture showed two figures holding hands, one tall with dark hair, the other small with blonde curls. Above them was a clumsy but heartfelt message, "Me and Daddy." She didn't wait for praise, she simply stepped closer and leaned her head against his arm, as if sensing the weight on his shoulders. Andrew wrapped his arm around her instinctively, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As the custody hearing drew near, the tension in the house rose. Staff spoke in hushed tones, security remained on high alert, and Andrew barely slept. The night before the hearing, he woke to the sound of soft footsteps. Lily stood in the doorway clutching her bear, her eyes wide and worried. He lifted the blanket in silent invitation, and she climbed into bed beside him. After a few minutes, she whispered, "If they make me leave, can I still visit you?" The question shattered him. He pulled her close, holding her gently but firmly. "No one is going to make you leave," he said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay strong. "You belong here. With me." She pressed her small hand against his chest, as if memorizing the heartbeat beneath her palm. Eventually, she fell asleep curled against him, trusting him more deeply than she trusted the world. He stayed awake long after, staring at the ceiling, consumed by the realization that his life, once defined by power, wealth, and solitude, had narrowed to one fragile truth: losing Lily was the one thing he could not survive. When morning came, he dressed not like a billionaire but like a father going into battle. Not for reputation. Not for pride. For a little girl who had already lost too much. And as they walked into the courthouse together, Lily's hand wrapped tightly around his, he understood that whatever the outcome, he would fight until his last breath to keep her safe. The courtroom felt colder than any place Andrew had ever stepped into, despite the polished wood, the muted lighting, and the quiet hum of murmured voices. He entered holding Lily's hand, her small fingers gripping his as though he were the only stable thing in a world that had changed too many times for her to trust it. She wore a simple white dress chosen by the housekeeper that morning, and though she looked clean and neatly brushed, she carried an unmistakable heaviness behind her blue eyes. Every few steps she glanced up at him, silently asking if he was still there, still fighting, still unshaken. Every time, he squeezed her hand back. Alice's estranged relatives sat stiffly across the room, their faces tight with a mix of indignation and greed. They had lost any right to moral authority the moment they abandoned Alyssa during her darkest years, yet here they were claiming they wanted Lily, for her own good. Andrew felt anger rise inside him, but he swallowed it down because he knew the judge would be watching every gesture, every expression, every breath. This was not a battle won by emotion, it would be won by proof, consistency, and the bond he and Lily had forged in the short but life-altering time since she arrived at his doorstep. The hearing began with formalities, then testimony. Andrew listened as witnesses described the criminal network Alyssa had been entangled in, the threats she faced, the steps she took to protect Lily. For the first time, the judge saw documented evidence of fear that had shaped Alyssa's final years. Lily sat silently beside Andrew, one hand gripping her bear hidden beneath the table. When the opposition began questioning his fitness, suggesting he had only recently entered Lily's life and that wealth alone did not guarantee stability, Andrew felt the familiar fire ignite in his chest. But he did not raise his voice. He answered every accusation with calm certainty, explaining what Lily had endured, what he had discovered, how he had taken immediate responsibility, and what he had already done to provide safety, medical care, psychological support, and a nurturing environment. His attorneys bolstered his statements with documentation and testimony from teachers, doctors, and child specialists. But the moment that changed the entire atmosphere came unexpectedly. When Dr. Rowan spoke, she described Lily's transformation from a frightened, hypervigilant child into one who had begun forming secure attachment. She emphasized that this progress hinged entirely on consistency and trust, two things Lily had finally found. Removing her from Mr. Riddle at this stage, Dr. Rowan said gently, would not only reverse her progress but could inflict permanent emotional harm. This child does not simply live in his house. She feels safe in his presence. The judge nodded thoughtfully, but nothing prepared the room for what happened next. The judge asked whether Lily wished to speak. Andrew immediately started to shake his head, ready to decline on her behalf, but Lily tugged on his sleeve. She stood, her legs trembling slightly, and faced the judge with the bravery of someone who had learned to survive long before she learned to play. I want to stay with him, she said, her voice small but steady. He's my daddy. He didn't know about me before, but now he does, and he takes care of me. Mommy told me to find him if I needed help. She said he's the only one who would protect me. She paused, swallowing hard as her fingers tightened around the bear. And she was right. A hush fell over the room. Even the opposing relatives shifted uncomfortably, realizing the strength in her words was not something they could dismiss with legal argument. Andrew felt tears threaten, but he held them back, knowing this moment was hers, not his. When Lily finished, she returned to his side, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, grounding her with his presence. After closing statements, the judge recessed to deliberate. Those minutes stretched endlessly. Andrew sat with Lily on a wooden bench in the hallway, her head resting against his arm. He expected her to ask questions or express fear, but instead she whispered, "If they make me leave, will you still find me?" The thought alone made his throat tighten. He leaned down and kissed her hair. "No one is going to make you leave," he said. "And even if something in this world tried, would cross every border, climb every mountain, and break every law necessary to bring you home." She nodded, content with the promise, and closed her eyes. When the judge finally returned, everyone filed back into the courtroom. Andrew held Lily's hand again, heart pounding. The judge looked at him first, then at Lily, then at the opposing relatives before delivering the decision with clear conviction. Custody was granted to Andrew permanently. The judge cited the strength of the bond, Lily's safety, her emotional well-being, and the extensive evidence of danger from the individuals who had harmed Alyssa. Furthermore, the judge ordered restraining measures against the relatives who had attempted to claim custody without demonstrating meaningful involvement in Lily's life. As the words sank in, Lily didn't react at first, as though afraid to believe them. But when Andrew lifted her into his arms, a smile slowly spread across her face, small and fragile but real. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder and whispered, "We can go home now." "Yes," he murmured, holding her tightly. "We can go home." Back at the mansion, staff welcomed Lily with warm smiles and gentle gestures. Andrew carried her up the stairs, her arms wrapped around his neck, her bear tucked securely between them. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't ask if she needed to pack her things. She didn't ask where she would sleep or whether she would stay. She simply asked if they could read a story tonight, one of the books she had pointed to shyly in his office days ago. Andrew tucked her into bed and stayed until she fell asleep, her hand still curled around his. When he finally stepped out of the room and closed the door, he leaned against the wall, overwhelmed with relief, grief, and a fierce, unshakable love. His life had changed irrevocably, but not in the way he once feared. The emptiness that once echoed through his enormous home had been replaced by a heartbeat not his own, a heartbeat that had become part of his world in a way he could never let go. Lily had come into his life asking only for help with her mother's burial. She stayed because, somewhere between grief and healing, she had found her father. And Andrew knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would walk through all of them with her hand in his. Their story had been born from tragedy, shaped by courage and redeemed by love. And as he looked down the long hallway leading to Lily's room, he realized something profound: he no longer walked that hall alone.